here are some tips on how to give a truly terrible sermon. This from a list originally by Reverend Jane Rzepka and Reverend Ken Sawyer, two Unitarian Universalist ministers who wrote the very, very fine preaching manual called Thematic Preaching, but also added to by others, by me, by students in my preaching classes at Meadville Lombard Theological School, and teaching classes I've led for lay folks in Erica Hewitt's very excellent lay preaching seminar, The Shared Pulpit. I'm hoping that you can add more terrible ways to give a sermon. Add them in the comments below if there are some that I haven't covered. There's construction in the building today, so if you hear the sound of smashing and clanging, don't worry, it's just walls being torn out upstairs. All right, way number one, make the sermon longer than they expect. I don't mean that you preach for 17 minutes and they expected you to preach for 15 minutes. I mean they expected you to preach for 10 minutes and you preached for 20. Or they expected you to preach for 15 minutes and you preached for like 25 or 30. It's not the case that long sermons are bad or not working or like can't be preached. The point of preaching, though, is to be heard by your listeners. And if they've got enough attention and stamina only to get through 10 minutes, because that's what they're used to week in and week out, you can't expect them to all of a sudden just be down for 20 minutes of preaching. You got to help build those muscles up for it. Always, a long good sermon is better than a short bad sermon, or a short good sermon is better than a long bad sermon. But it's not about the length as much as it is about helping people be able to hear it. So that says, what's the culture of the congregation? What are their expectations? What can you get away with? What can you not get away with? 2, preach mostly about yourself. If you're new in a pulpit, if you're guest preaching somewhere, you've got to tell them something about yourself because preaching is relational. You need to be in conversation and relationship with each other. So how do they get some visibility to some of who you are? That's different than preaching mostly about yourself. Here's the story of my spiritual journey. Great. What about us? You know we're also in the room here. Here's the series of anecdotes about my life. That's nice. Now we know something about your life. Where are we in your sermon? Where are we? How do you invite us in? Preach inaudibly. The point is to be heard, and if you preach inaudibly, it's not really going to be very effective to be able to be heard. Probably you have a mic, so you could get in on your mic a little bit more, and even if your voice is really quiet, you could still come really in close to your mic. Mine's over here. And people can hear you, so you don't have to shout at the top of your voice all the time, but you have to use the tools you have so that people can hear what you're doing. Assume that you are more spiritually evolved than they are, and try to bring them along. Everyone likes being patronized by their minister. There are surely folks in the room who know things that you don't, have experienced things that you won't, and bring a wisdom that you don't have. Be humble about that. There's that funny juxtaposition of getting up in front of a room full of people to speak while they are not allowed to say anything, but at the same time, you got to bring an extra dose of humility to go with that one. 5, ignore the service around the sermon. Ignore the service around the sermon. Well, if I have a very good sermon, it doesn't matter that the music is entirely unrelated, that the reading goes on forever and is nonsensical, or that the prayer makes no acknowledgement of the major events that have just happened in the world, or town, or community this week. Ignore the service around the sermon, because it's really just the sermon that matters. No, the service is a unified whole. The service is a singular thing, in the same way that fine dining, all the courses go together. There's a trajectory to it. The other thing to remember is that your sermon, the sermon, for many people in the room, just simply isn't the most important thing for them. It's just not what they came to church for that day. It's not what they're there for. Maybe they came to sing. Maybe they came in deep grief just to be held in the prayer. Maybe they came in loneliness to be in community. Maybe they came for the meeting that is happening after the service that they're nervous about. And they're just trying to still and steady themselves to make it through and get there. When I was a member at First Universalist in Minneapolis, they had a practice then of having a lay member of the congregation work with one of the ministers to write a chalice lighting. That was the theme of the service. It was often like an anecdote or an incident or an experience that spoke powerfully and directly from their life into the theme of the service. And they worked and crafted this thing. That congregation had excellent preaching. That congregation had unbelievable music. That congregation had a warm and generous, welcoming heart and deep, intense prayer. And the thing that fed me the most every week was that chalice lighting. So you can't ignore the service around the sermon, nor can you even assume the sermon is the most important thing that's going on. Choose a topic that only you care about. I cannot preach on just Legos every Sunday. I would probably just preach on Legos every Sunday. No. Or my dog, maybe. It doesn't mean that it can't be a topic you care about. I think I've preached once about Legos in the last 8 years or so. But you have to invite people in and make it accessible. I'm a great big Star Wars nerd. I preached once on the parallels between the formation of the Star Wars canon, what counts as part of that universe, and the Christian canon, because many of exactly the same arguments and ideas are happening between the two of them. So I got one Star Wars, I got one Legos in over the year. Maybe you can get away with that more frequently. But the point in both of those is that you're inviting people into it and you're using it as an illustration of a thing that is accessible and real and meaningful to other people beside yourself. Just because you had a deep, intense, powerful, aesthetic experience watching some movie or TV show doesn't necessarily mean that anyone else had. And you having that experience isn't a sermon. You having that experience isn't even an anecdote in the sermon. Because you've got to invite folks into that, build the bridge and the connection between whatever the particular is from your own life or experience into the universal that people can identify with and connect to. 7, crude language helps. It sure fucking does. There are different norms and expectations in different communities, and there are different contexts where different sorts of language works, and it's not the case that, you can never say certain things. But probably you can't. The point in all of that is not to be inauthentic to yourself, but to say, is me using this language going to help my listeners understand and connect in the way that I want them to, or is it going to distance them? Is this going to be an on-ramp into the sermon, or is this going to be an off-ramp? And that person is going to spend the next 5 minutes thinking about, what the hell did that preacher just say from the pulpit? 8, exclude some parishioners with your theology. Everybody loves that. Oh, there are so many terrible ways to do this. So don't exclude parishioners with your theology. You serve, as a Unitarian Universalist, an intentionally plural congregation. A congregation that is united not by creed, not by a bullet point list of the things that we all believe in common, not a set of propositions that we share about the nature of life, death, reality, and the universe, but instead a set of shared values, which are expressed in really different ways, and which are arrived at through many different paths. Your work is to take that seriously. There aren't some real UU theologies, cough cough humanists, and then the rest of them. We're not a plural church if the way we express that pluralism is simply by not talking about things. In the same way that it's not welcome for queer folks never to mention their existence. That's not welcoming, that's erasure. It's the same thing. It's not welcoming to different theologies not to mention them. It's not welcoming and plural never to mention folks who believe in God and have a personal relationship with a higher power, even if the majority of the church doesn't. That theology is not a democracy. We don't all show up in a plural church and then vote on the one theology that we're all going to have and everyone else be damned. You're the sheepdog. You're guarding the boundaries of that plural congregation. And you're not doing it if you're not deliberately engaging and naming multiple theologies. So don't exclude parishioners with your theology. On the other hand, here's 9. Here's a way to give a truly terrible sermon. Have no religious point. People have so many good places to go for wonderful, wonderful information and talks and conversations. There's this website, TED.com, and all it has on it are recordings of the best talks of their career of every single person on that site. If we are trying to compete with a lecture society, unless you're that good, you will fail. And even if you are that good, you're going to set the next preacher up for failure when people arrive expecting one of the greatest lectures they've ever heard and proceed not to get it. Have a religious point. Speak to the transcendent, not just the mundane. Speak to the deepest values that animate and drive us. Connect people not just into the world that we experience through our 5 senses and our thinking mind, but into that interior world of experience, which is invisible, each of us to each other. What is the religious point that you're making? Why is this a sermon that you're preaching in a congregation? 10. Tell a story about someone without permission. Oh, yeah. Tell a story about someone without permission. The maxim I always come back to is that surprised people behave badly. You tell a story about someone, and the first time that they know that you're telling a story about them is when they're sitting in the middle of the congregation and you're preaching it? No, ask them. Have the respect to people to ask them if you can use their story. And that absolutely, emphatically, and unambiguously applies to your family, your spouse, your kids. Just because your kids are 5 years old does not mean you get to get up in the pulpit and say whatever wacky thing they did that week. You don't have the right to change their relationship with your congregation that way, to use them as the butt of a joke or as the source of deep spiritual insight. Have the respect for the autonomy of others to let them be autonomous people. Doesn't mean you can't do it. Just ask. Just ask. I want to tell this story about what happened in this way. How would that be? Is that okay? It's that simple. It's that simple. All right, that's number 1 through 10. We're going to continue with the next 10. I have at least 43 of these. If there are other ways to give a truly terrible sermon, add them below. And since this feels very YouTube-y, don't forget to like and subscribe.